What is evil? Why does evil exist? How does God allow evil? Is there a battle between good and evil? And who is going to win? As always, I will share answers I found. I do not claim they are absolute truth, but they work for me as they passed my personal exam on logic, lack of ambiguity, and conceptual completeness. You can test them as well, or simply use them as food for thought. As usual, if you are bored by long chains of considerations or logical sequences, this video might not be for you at all, but you can try the time codes to jump to parts that interest you more, although the sections are built the same way, as a flow of thoughts, still not devoid of formal logic. What is the paradox of evil, or the problem of evil? It is the question, why does evil exist? In other words, if God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenEvolent, then why is there suffering, pain, and evil? Spoiler, none of the systems can answer this fully. That is why it is a paradox. However, there are insightful moments on the journey. First, let's agree on definitions. Here and further, God is mentioned as the origin of everything, not simply creator, but original source of all, at the same time as the limit of all, infinite and non-derivable, an all-embracing absolute, and therefore everything is within God on all levels, material and non-material. God as the unified field as base of all physical forces, the singularity of existence, the entanglement of all particles, the sort of mind universe appears to form by its galaxies, the superposition of all universes, the life in its origin and at its limit, the infinity of dimensions, God with absolute will. That is kind of God I am referring here to, the kind of God this channel is about. If you believe there is no force like that, then the paradox does not exist for you at all. Congratulations. So why is it not all pure good in the world if all is within God, who is supposed to be purely good? At least in many religions, God is pictured this way. Let's warm up with psychological explanation first. For example, some psychologists, particularly within Jungian thought, suggest that God needs an opponent to learn about himself, like a client needs a therapist, not because the therapist is smarter or knows more, but merely because they are outside the client's own system and can provide the other part of the picture, making it fuller. This is another interpretation of the polarity approach, where one is opposed to the other. But we are talking about God, the one that by definition is the origin and receptacle of everything and therefore contains everything, including all polarities, a closed system in which nothing exists outside but all is inside. Because if anything was outside, that would form a new system together with the initial one, which again brings us to a new closed system, which then should be called God. So mathematically speaking, a need for an external opponent is a recursively incomplete idea. We cannot postulate an entity outside of God. Still, the idea of polar forces needed for learning is worth considering, so I will save it for further investigation. Returning now to the religious teachings and searching for the answer to the paradox within them. In Christianity, for example, there is no real explanation for why evil or the devil as its personification exists. The usual account is that the devil was a fallen angel who rebelled because of the free will God gave him. But the question remains, why did the intent to rebel, leading him to become evil, arise in him in the first place? If everything was created by God, including free will granted, then this being was created with a seed of non-lovable intention. So why would God create that? Why does suffering happen, especially child suffering? For adults, it can be explained as punishment for sins, but what about infants? Why do they even suffer? Christianity does not answer this. It accepts the paradox, predicts a cosmic battle apocalypse, and assures us that God will ultimately defeat evil, but without explaining why evil exists at all. Christianity also says God cannot simply destroy evil. I mean, God can for sure, since God is omnipotent, but if God destroyed it, God would become evil himself. This is one way Christianity explains why God does not intervene directly to wipe out evil. If God did, God would be acting in evil. Instead, God is trying to cure evil, to bring it back into good through free will. The main contradiction in Christianity is considering the devil as a separate creature from God, which makes them both more like opposing deities, which belittles God too powerful but still a figure. And God does not look like an infinite absolute then, according to the definition postulated earlier. That is my personal problem with the Old Testament, showing God as a powerful deity rather than the origin of all, even though I believe those books are all based on real events. In the New Testament, God is different. Jesus' teachings depict God as absolute power, energy, rather than a personage. Still intentionally selected, redacted, and sometimes lost in translations, texts do not explain the paradox. Some apocryphal texts describe how evil appeared on a more fundamental level rather than as a historical event, but anyway do not tell why it appeared. For example, the Secret Book of John offers an idea. Other sources say similar things about the structure of existence, from the source and non material levels down to the material world. I'm not saying this text describes how exactly everything is structured, as no one knows for sure except God, but if we accept it as the result of revelation, it gives a useful perspective then, repeating Vedic knowledge in its own words. According to the Secret Book of John, God separated from himself some part of his energy, or as the text says, his reflection, or his thought about himself, his awareness. This thought or reflection, still part of God as a closed system, became the spirit, similar to the Brahma concept in Vedas. From there, other levels of existence were created, and at some level, a mistake or glitch appeared due to incompleteness of creation. That created entity acted in ignorance and desired to be the absolute God. According to this apocryphal text, this creature is what the Old Testament God is. However, it appeared from God's energy, that first separated energy, or the first thought of God about himself. If that original thought contained a flaw, then everything developing from it would also carry that flaw. Does it mean God is imperfect? Is it another inconsistency? No, but I will touch on the question about perfection later. Religions that accept reincarnation, which by the way Christianity also did before the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, addressed the issue by saying that suffering comes from past lives. Even for innocent beings like infants, pain could be the result of actions in earlier incarnations. But again, the question arises, why did the wheel of samsara, the cycle of karma, start spinning at all? There must have been a first action, thought, or intention that created bad karma. Why did such a negative impulse appear in the first place? Even applying the concept of free will, we still don't know why negative intentions happen. Why did that bad seed appear? Buddhism rejects the idea of God and evil. Instead, it treats evil as harmful mental states and actions that create suffering, setting aside the question of ultimate purpose. Nothing is permanently evil. Everything can change through wisdom and compassion. But for me, this doesn't answer anything fundamental. Buddhism teaches that the universe has no first moment, no creation, no initial cause, only endless cycles of aimless arising and dissolving. Everything happens because conditions create more conditions. Buddhism denies good and evil as concepts, denies a creator, denies a beginning, denies a soul, denies an origin. It feels like avoiding difficult questions by declaring the questions meaningless. To me, it feels like mirrors and fogs. Buddhism also says the universe has no higher purpose, only personal liberation from suffering has meaning. Buddha avoided questions about origin because he said they don't help end suffering. Again, convenient escaping, no question, no problem. So Buddhist meaning is purely personal, temporary, and ends with the person within a life. If there is no higher meaning than liberation, then makes sense only to the physical body, but life itself loses purpose. Let me introduce some logic to the Buddhist chat. If the only goal is to remove suffering and there is no higher purpose, then the most direct and fastest way to achieve this goal is to simply end life. However, Buddhism suggests to live but keep decreasing suffering which is caused by living itself. Very contradictory to me. For me, such an approach would create suffering by its meaninglessness. Buddhism may help others, but for me personally, it makes life nonsense. So I'll set it aside. As anyway, it doesn't help with the paradox because paradox does not exist there. Another religious perspective on the paradox of evil is that the material world is simply a play of God, so-called lila, an act that has no need of us. God doesn't need us. The whole reality is just how God manifests himself. But why is some of that play so dark? In Hinduism, particularly in Vaishnavism tradition, the paradox of evil does not arise in the same way as in Western theology. God, Vishnu, Krishna, or Narayana, depending on the branch of the tradition, is understood as all good, all powerful, and the creator of everything. Still, according to tradition, evil is not created by God. It arises when free beings misuse their freedom. Every soul possesses free will because love of God must be voluntary. Evil occurs when a soul turns away from God and chooses self-centered desire over devotion. The material world is not a place of punishment, but a realm where souls who have turned away from God can exercise desire independently and gradually learn through experience that separation from the divine center leads to suffering. In this view, suffering is not God being cruel, it is a natural consequence of turning away from the divine. God allows suffering but does not will it. Evil is temporary, and liberation, which is soul's natural state, restores union with God, eliminating all ignorance and suffering. God remains untouched by evil, even while present within creation. Thus, the paradox is softened by the idea that evil is a transient distortion, not a fundamental force. However, a deeper question remains: if souls misuse free will, the potential for that misuse ultimately originates from God, because God is the creator and all embracing. Why does the capacity for wrong choice exist at all? The same question is about the devil in Christianity. And the way Vaishnavism addresses this is another trick. Watch the hands. Souls are eternal and beginningless. God did not create their nature at a specific moment, so the tendency to fall, if it exists, has always been part of the soul's eternal identity. The seed of evil, therefore, is not implanted by God, but belongs to the soul's own eternal constitution. But again, this effectively treats souls as entities separate from the absolute God, as if they are not part of God's system. Vaishnavism addresses it at a conceptual level. Non-good does not exist in God's essence, but in his energies, which are distinct from his nature. God's essence is pure, flawless, and untouched by evil or ignorance. His energies, Shakti, manifest as external spiritual energy, marginal souls, Jiva Shakti, and material illusion, Maya Shakti. These energies are dependent on God but are not identical to His essence. The analogy often used is the sun. The sun's core is pure fire. Its light expands outward, and shadows arise where objects block the light. The shadow exists not because of the sun, but because the objects, so darkness does not exist inside the sun. Similarly, God is pure goodness. Souls are rays of the sun, and the material world is shadows existing because of the sun's light, but not in the sun itself. This allows non-good to exist without touching God's essence. God remains pure. Evil exists within creation, not within the Creator. Nice try, but again and again, the paradox remains unresolved. First of all, creation is a continuation of the Creator, even if not its nature, but still its derivatives. Secondly, how come the material world is capable of creating those shadows? If God is the source of everything, then God is also the source of conditions that allow ignorance and suffering. Why would a perfectly good God create anything that generates shadows? If God is all-encompassing, then all possibilities exist within God. If God's essence is entirely good, how can anything not good come out of it? How can the possibility of misuse exist within God? And tada, Vaishnavism does not have a logical, complete answer to this. At the deepest level, the tradition admits that the existence of souls and energies capable of ignorance cannot be fully explained. It is inconceivable, achintya, and beyond human reason. God remains pure, the energies are beginningless, and their purpose is God's play, Lila, and it is inconceivable. Advaita Vedanta posits that only Brahman, pure, attributeless consciousness, exists. The world is an appearance, the material world, Maya, is unreal, and the paradox is resolved by denying ultimate reality to duality. However, this is largely a definitional maneuver, bringing us back to the same question just in different terms. Why do unreal limited modes appear at all, even in unreal holographic states? The answer there is the same, achintya, inconceivable. But the idea of the illusory nature of the material world is interesting. It resonates with physical hypothesis of a holographic universe.
This isn't real.
What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain.
I have my personal supporting experience for that, which I will share later as well. Kashmir Shaivism offers a more conceptually satisfying solution. God freely limits himself to explore his own nature. Remember the earlier psychological explanation about learning through opposition? It echoes this approach, telling that different modes are needed for developing interaction. In Kashmir Shaivism, everything, including apparent darkness, is an expression of God's consciousness, Shiva, through self-contraction and self-expression. Ignorance is not a flaw, but a voluntary mode of that consciousness, of that divine self-play, Lila. God's essence, Paramashiva, is infinite, still pure light, but his self-awareness, Shakti, manifests all modes of consciousness, light, dark, matter, duality, limitation, as expression of infinite freedom. Darkness exists because the infinite source can manifest all possibilities, including self-contraction, darkness, while light is self-recognition. These are movements of the same infinite consciousness, not flaws. God explores himself by differentiating potentialities. Self-expression, duality, and contraction are inherent aspects of infinite awareness. I mean, if awareness is infinite, then it has all potentials in it due to its endlessness. That one thought, may I be many, may I grow forth. In other words, the source, God's essence, is absolute still pure light, while the reflection, God's consciousness, is a combination of light and dark, as it is a dynamic manifestation of all potentials, including those that we consider evil, dark, which for God are just some limitations to explore himself. If to simplify, all existence around God's source is God's thinking, but his thoughts are worlds, universes, lives. We are his thoughts, and God is exploring himself through that thinking process, the same way we do, as a smaller representation of the original pattern. The same way our thought flow is not always smooth. Actually, it is smooth only when it is already solved, figured out. Otherwise, we have twists and turns during the process, arguments back and forth, and eliminating contradictions, leading to some ideas dying. And yes, some of God's thoughts are limitations, dark limitations, that on the level of our material lives we personify as evil, we experience as suffering. So we are God's thoughts that soar during God's contemplation, the divine self-play lila. Like training muscles in the gym, we overload them, limit them to make them grow. If muscles had consciousness, they would call training evil when muscle fibers are turned. But we know they are turned to grow stronger, stretched to later reach further. Moreover, sometimes some muscles are used to load the others to create that movement. Using this allegory, we are the mental muscles of God. We are what God is thinking, and that correlates with some traditions calling the material world unreal or illusion or the dream of God. Let me share my experience that helped me understand this deeper and made me believe that. I once had a dream, almost 20 years ago, but I got it only now. Probably that is why I remembered it so vividly, as I would need it later. I woke up and sat in my bed. Through the window I saw the city from above my floor. A beautiful sunrise with red and purple clouds, rare colors for that region, so it felt cinematic. Suddenly a plane fell from the sky and crashed into a building on the horizon. Terrified, I woke up again and sat on the bed, only to see the exact same view through the window, the same cinematic sunrise, identical in every detail and color. The only difference was that there was no crash. While I was trying to make sense of this, the floor of my apartment began to tilt. The whole building started leaning, which I clearly felt with my body sliding off the bed, and I realized the building was going to collapse. Another wave of terror hit me, and then I woke up again and sat on the bed, the third time. Once more, the sunrise was there, red and purple, exactly the same colors, clouds, and perspective of buildings outside as before. It was a dream within a dream within a dream, with absolutely identical, repeatedly recreated surroundings. Nolan's Inception was about to happen only, so I could not blame my memory for that. I didn't even know back then that such a phenomenon existed. At the time I tried Freudian analysis, searching for symbols. Only years later did I understand. The dream was teaching me that our reality itself might be some kind of a dream. How do I know I am not yet in the dream now, just another layer? Only because I have not yet woken up again.
Have you ever had a dream, Neo, that you were so sure was real? What if you were unable to wake from that dream? How would you know the difference between the dream world and the real world?
This can't be.
Be what? Be real?
So this reality might be what God is imagining. For him, it is an illusion. When I say an illusion, I don't mean that we do not exist. We do, but I mean that this existence is in God's consciousness, the same as dreams are for us. This material existence is merely a temporary dream or illusion from God's perspective, but illusion for God, not for humans, not for our material bodies. For us as bodies, minds, and egos, it is the field of existence. For us as souls, it is a powerful simulation. Think about virtual reality. When we put on VR glasses, it looks and feels real. Only knowing it isn't helps not to fall into it completely. Why wouldn't God, the absolute powerful consciousness, be able to create an even more convincing reality? My answer is God would, and did, just by the force of his imagination, and we are in it as his thoughts. If it bothers someone, then it means the ego is touched. As exactly the material ego perceives the material world through the prism of good and evil, as it perceives the world egocentrically in relation to itself, that is the root cause of suffering, the wrong understanding of where the center is. From the other side, our soul, as a fragment of God, is how God is exploring. God parts himself into souls to get the experience of limitation. What ego feels as suffering from external forces, the soul is experiencing as learning. That fragment of God experiences it as exploration. And our spirit, as a fractal part of the whole God, is observing, enjoying, and creating a move in the heart towards light. If to put aside ego as much as possible in this material existence, ego that is suffering from all this, we would see a beautiful picture of God learning hard, creating for himself all the possible obstacles, being in the mode of soul, intentionally made to forget its part of the whole. And only spirit quietly helps to remember, as it cannot ruin the play, only guide, creating the move inside the heart towards light. God is giving himself the hardest classes ever. Isn't that powerful? Which doesn't cancel out the fact that it is painful for ego, which is part of God again, as odd as it feels. Thus, if God has the still essence and the dynamic awareness, two questions arise from this. The first question, as I promised earlier to consider, is God perfect? If yes, why does God need this thinking, this self-play, self-exploring, self-investigation, and even self-extension as a result? It is a territory of definitions. On a human level, we consider perfect as something that does not need any corrections or changes, as it is already perfect. But if we postulate perfect as an absolute of forms and modes, then God's dynamic energy containing infinite possible modes can itself be considered perfection, and then God is perfect, even though God is extending, evolving. But if not to hide in definitions, both perfections exist: absolutely pure, still, non-changing light as God's essence, and God's dynamic manifestation as light and shadows. And it is a personal choice what to consider perfect: the pure center or self-awareness full of all infinite possibilities. And the second question: if God's self-play is the manifestation of any of all infinite possibilities, then the possibility of absolute infinite stillness or absolute good is one of them. Why does God not manifest it? Why does God still choose other modes which have darkness and ignorance that we experience as evil and suffering, or God experiences as limitations? Absolute stillness could theoretically be manifested, but note that would end all play, and it means that no further manifestation will happen. The only answer I see to this question, given God's absolute will, which we inherit, is that God wills not to stop the play. God wills to continue limitations. And the answer to the paradox of evil, then, is this: what we call evil are modes or limitations that God is choosing to continue for self-investigation, while absolute good is an available option. God chooses to keep training even when muscles are sore. It's just that we are the muscles. Again, God chooses limitations deliberately. Absolute still light contains no internal differentiation or dynamic variation, has no change for other possibilities, only infinite stillness. Once the possibility of absolute stillness is chosen, nothing will happen after, just infinite still being of absolute good with no possibility to change. That is the true apocalypse. And my next question would be: is absolute good then a kind of a death of God? Is that why God is not choosing the mode of absolute light stillness?